Gavin Moore thought he was buying peace and quiet until the HOA turned his dream home into a legal battleground. What started as a few strange violation letters quickly spiraled into midnight surveillance, hidden votes, and a shocking plan to seize his property. Gavin never imagined the people meant to protect his neighborhood would be the ones to destroy everything he built. This is the story of how one HOA's unchecked power led to police at Gavin's door and a demand that would change his life forever. It started as a dream come true. After years of renting cramped apartments and saving every extra dollar, I finally found a home I could afford in a peaceful suburban neighborhood. It was tucked away behind a row of oak trees, with wide sidewalks, quiet cul-de-sacs, and freshly painted houses that all seemed to match perfectly. Everything looked organized, clean, and serene, the kind of place people settle into for a lifetime. There was an HOA, of course, but that didn't seem like a big deal. The listing agent even said it helped keep the neighborhood beautiful and safe. That sounded reassuring. On move-in day, the sun was out, and my car was packed with boxes, plants, and hopes for a fresh start. A few neighbors waved politely. Some smiled as they walked their dogs. It all felt warm and welcoming. When I opened my mailbox for the first time, there was already an envelope inside from the HOA. It was a neatly folded welcome letter, printed on thick paper with the HOAS logo on top. Inside was a small booklet of community guidelines about trash days, lawn care, paint colors, and fence heights. It seemed overly detailed, but not unreasonable. I skimmed through it, set it aside, and kept unpacking. The next morning, I noticed a white SUV slowly driving past my house. It wasn't speeding or doing anything unusual, but it paused for a little too long right in front of my driveway. I watched from the kitchen window, thinking maybe they were lost. But the same SUV came by again that afternoon, and again, the following morning. On the third day, I caught a glimpse of the logo on the side. It was the HOA's community enforcement vehicle. Later that week, I received another envelope. This time, it wasn't as friendly. The letter said an inspection of my exterior property was scheduled for the upcoming weekend. It specifically mentioned a shed in my backyard that might be non-compliant with visual standards. That struck me as odd. The shed was old, but solid. It had been there when I bought the house, and it was listed in the property description. I assumed this was some sort of routine check and didn't think much more about it. Saturday came, and I heard movement behind the house. I looked out and saw two people wearing HOA badges taking photos of my shed. They didn't knock, they didn't announce themselves. They simply walked in, looked around, jotted some notes, and left. No introduction, no explanation. I wasn't sure if this was normal, but I was new to the neighborhood and didn't want to cause problems, so I let it go. The following Monday, another letter arrived. This one was marked Notice of Violation. According to the document, my shed was painted in an unapproved color, which clashed with the surrounding homes. I was given 10 days to repaint it, or I'd be fined $100 for every additional week it remained unchanged. I read the letter twice, then checked the color. Faded beige, completely ordinary. I checked the HOA guidelines again and couldn't even find a specific section about shed paint. Still, I didn't want to start my time in this new place on the wrong foot, so I went out, bought paint, and covered the entire structure in a color I hoped would be acceptable. That was supposed to be the end of it, but a week later, a new notice appeared. This time, they said my grass was overgrown. I had mowed it the day before. The violations kept coming: small things, vague things, trash bins left out too long, a crack in the driveway, a wind chime causing noise disturbance. One after another, each with a fine, a deadline, and the same robotic language. I began to feel like I was being watched. What started as a peaceful dream home was already beginning to shift into something else, something far more controlling, and I didn't realize then just how far it would go. The violation letters didn't stop. Every week brought a new envelope, each stamped with bold red letters that made my stomach drop before I even opened it. At first I thought it was a mistake. Maybe the HOA had incorrect records, or maybe they were just overly cautious with new homeowners. I tried to stay ahead, mowing twice a week, trimming every bush, moving trash cans exactly on schedule, but nothing seemed to make a difference. The tone of the letters grew colder, more demanding. They no longer referred to me as a valued resident. Instead, they labeled me not compliant. Then came the notice about my mailbox. It claimed the mailbox stood 2 inches taller than the regulation height. I measured it myself. It was exactly the same height as my neighbor's. Still, they fined me and gave a deadline to replace or lower to approved standard. It didn't make sense. I asked around, casually speaking to neighbors during evening walks. A few of them hinted at similar experiences, but were quick to change the subject. One older man simply said, "They've got their favorites," and walked off. No one seemed willing to talk openly. Soon after, I noticed a man in a polo shirt, pacing in front of my house. He had a clipboard and a measuring wheel, walking the perimeter of my front yard like he was surveying it. I watched from behind the blinds. He didn't knock. He didn't introduce himself. When I finally stepped outside to ask what he was doing, he was already back in his SUV, driving off. That afternoon, I received another notice. This time, it said I had extended my garden bed beyond the property's aesthetic line, a term I couldn't even find in the HOA handbook. I hadn't changed a thing in the front yard. The garden bed was exactly where it had always been. Things began to feel less like coincidence and more like a pattern. I wasn't just being watched, I was being scrutinized. Even harmless things, like a small solar light I had installed near the walkway, were flagged. Unauthorized exterior lighting. The letters now came with photos, attached blurry, close-up shots of the supposed violations, as if someone was sneaking around my property at odd hours. The final straw came when I received a formal summons to an HOA hearing. It was scheduled for the following week, at the community clubhouse. The letter was filled with jargon, accumulated infractions, continued disregard for community harmony, subject to enforcement measures. I didn't know what to expect. The entire situation felt unreal. It was hard to believe that a group meant to enhance property values and maintain community peace had turned into something so aggressively invasive. I tried calling the HOA office. No one picked up. I left voicemails, no return calls. I sent emails. All I got were automated responses. It felt like I was trying to reason with a machine. There was no face to argue with, no one willing to explain what was happening. Every violation, every fine, every demand came from behind a wall of policy and procedure. Impossible to break through. The night before the hearing, I couldn't sleep. I stayed up rereading every notice, organizing them by date, printing out photos of my home to prove nothing was wrong, but deep down, I had a growing sense of dread. This wasn't about grass height or mailbox measurements anymore. It was something bigger, something hidden beneath all the paperwork and policies, and I had no idea just how far they were willing to go to make me comply. The day of the hearing arrived with gray skies and a heavy silence. I walked into the HOA clubhouse carrying a folder stuffed with evidence, photos, letters, copies of emails, and handwritten notes tracking every violation I'd received since moving in. The clubhouse was colder than I expected, not in temperature, but in atmosphere. The walls were lined with framed photos of community events, barbecues, holiday parties, smiling neighbors, but the people sitting behind the long table at the front didn't smile. There were 5 of them, 4 board members and 1 person I didn't recognize, a man in a suit with a legal pad in front of him. No introductions were offered. No one asked me how I was doing. They simply gestured for me to sit. The meeting began with a dry recitation of my infractions. Every violation was read aloud like a list of charges. The shed paint, the mailbox, the solar light, the grass, the garden bed. More had been added since the last notice, things I'd never even heard about. Apparently, my gutter downspout angle didn't conform to drainage alignment expectations, and the reflective sticker on my trash bin lid was not aesthetically appropriate for curb presentation. I wanted to laugh at the absurdity, but their faces were serious, almost stone-like. No reaction, no humor, just enforcement. I started to defend myself, pointing out that many of these rules were vague or missing entirely from the handbook, showed them the photos I'd taken, emails I'd sent, and the complete lack of response from their office. They listened in silence. When I finished, the man in the suit quietly slid a paper across the table. The board president picked it up and read it out loud. It was a notice of potential reassignment to formal resolution that, if I continued to accrue fines or failed to resolve pending compliance matters, the HOA had the right to request a reassessment of property designation. The wording was dense, but one thing was clear. They were laying the foundation to take control of part of my land. I asked them what that meant. The response was swift and chilling. A clause buried deep in the HOA bylaws gave the board the ability to propose changes to land use designations for the benefit of the community. If a property was deemed consistently non-compliant, my lot, they explained, had been listed on a proposal from last year to be used as a potential site for a small walking trail that would connect to parts of the neighborhood. The proposal had been tabled, not dismissed. Now, with my long list of violations, they were reopening it. I left the meeting with a sinking feeling. I had never agreed to any of this. No one had told me about the redevelopment plan when I bought the house. No one warned me that failure to perfectly conform to a constantly shifting rulebook could be used as justification to claim my property. I checked the HOA documents I had signed during closings. There were over 200 pages. Buried somewhere in that mountain of legal text was a clause allowing this exact maneuver. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about a walking trail, it was about control. I remembered what the old neighbor had said weeks ago, got their favorites. I realized I wasn't one of them. Maybe I had moved in without knowing the unspoken rules. Maybe I hadn't played the game the way they wanted. But now, I was on a list I couldn't escape. A target marked by policy, hidden votes, and legal tricks I was never meant to see. And the worst part, I didn't even know what would happen next. Things started changing faster than I could keep up. I woke one morning to find my trash bins missing from the curb. I thought maybe someone had stolen them, but by mid-afternoon, they were back, only they were damaged, with both lids ripped off and one wheel cracked. Taped to the front door was yet another violation letter. Bins not returned to proper storage within HOA timeframe. I checked my camera footage but found nothing unusual. Then I remembered the strange shadows I'd seen through the blinds the night before, figures moving just beyond the edge of the lawn, quiet and quick. Hadn't paid much attention at the time. Now I wasn't so sure. Soon after, I found the lock to my backyard gate tampered with. It wasn't broken, just scratched, like someone had tried to force it open but gave up halfway. I replaced it and installed a new motion-activated camera above the back door. That same night, it recorded two men walking along the fence line. One held a flashlight, the other a clipboard. Both wore matching dark polos with a barely visible logo: HOA Security Patrol. They didn't come through the gate. They didn't knock. They just observed, took notes, and walked off into the night. The violations became more aggressive. Excessive leaf buildup, despite it being early spring. Fence slat misalignment, though it was perfectly straight. Driveway discoloration, even though it had just rained. Every little detail was being turned against me. I felt like I was under surveillance every hour of the day. I'd catch glimpses of that same white SUV slowly cruising by, stopping in front of my house for too long, then disappearing down the road. The pressure was mounting, not just on paper but emotionally. I started to avoid going outside. Even walking to the mailbox felt like stepping onto a stage. Then I noticed the flags. Tiny plastic markers, like the kind used by utility companies, were suddenly staked into my side yard. Blue, red, yellow. At first I thought it was a city project, maybe something unrelated, but none of my neighbors had them. I called the HOA office again, no answer. The next day, a thin metal post appeared near the sidewalk, painted bright orange, with a laminated tag stapled to the top. Community Assessment Point Zone C. I had no idea what that meant, but it sounded official and ominous. I visited the county records office to get answers. That's when I learned that HOA had submitted a request for minor community expansion to include portions of surrounding easements for public utility and beautification purposes. My property line fell directly into the zone they had highlighted. According to the filing, this wasn't just a proposal anymore. It was in motion, approved, quietly, legally. I went home and reviewed every HOA document I could find. There it was, hidden in a footnote in Section 8. Excessive violation accumulation may result in reassignment or partial forfeiture of individual easement privileges to the Association for Community Use. It didn't say what excessive meant, no number, no limit, just vague language open to interpretation. They had built the trap before I ever moved in. I had walked right into it. I started calling attorneys. Most wouldn't even return my messages. The ones that did told me the HOAS bylaws were airtight, ironclad. One of them said I could try to fight it, but it would be long, expensive, and likely unsuccessful. They had time. They had money. They had the rules on their side. All I had was a house that was now being claimed, piece by piece, by people I'd never even spoken to. People hiding behind board meetings, legal language, and shadowy night inspections. And I still didn't know what the endgame was until the knock came. The knock came just after sunrise. 3 sharp raps against the front door, firm and unmistakable. I had barely slept the night before, pacing through the house, double-checking locks, peering through the blinds at every passing car. When I opened the door, 2 uniformed officers stood on the porch, calm but serious. Behind them was the HOA's familiar white SUV, parked just far enough to appear casual. One officer held a folder thick with documents. He informed me that a civil complaint had been filed against me by the Homeowners Association and that they were here to serve notice of pending action. The folder was handed over without emotion, like it was routine, but it didn't feel routine to me. It felt like everything had finally tipped. Inside the folder were pages of paperwork, legal documents, photographs, maps, and a formal request for limited property acquisition under the HOA's existing development plan. They weren't asking, they were notifying. A section of my property, the side yard and part of the driveway, was to be transitioned into Phase 1 of the Eastwood Trail project, an HOA initiative I had never voted on, never agreed to, and had never even been consulted about. The basis for this action was listed as chronic non-compliance, resulting in accumulated forfeiture credits. I didn't even know what forfeiture credits were. No one had ever explained them to me. I searched the documents for a list of infractions, hoping to find a mistake I could use as a defense. But every violation over the past few months was carefully documented, photographed, and categorized. Many were exaggerated or outright false, but in the face of the HOAs, my arguments didn't seem to matter. This wasn't a court case, it was execution by technicality. The officers weren't hostile. They told me I had a week to comply with the transition or risk legal obstruction charges. According to the documents, once the deadline passed, the HOA had permission to begin physical modifications to the property. That meant construction, fencing, digging, demolition, whatever they deemed necessary. I asked if I could appeal. One officer hesitated before saying, "You'll need to take that up with the HOA board," but I already knew what that meant. I'd tried before. Emails went unanswered. Phone calls redirected to voicemails. The board was a fortress I couldn't penetrate. The following days were a blur. Orange flags multiplied in the yard. Small stakes were driven into the ground along new lines, marking off what used to be mine. A sign appeared, staked into the grass without my consent, "Future site of Eastwood Trail connecting our community." Neighbors walked by and stared but said nothing. A few offered looks of sympathy, but no one dared speak. Everyone knew that if they challenged the board, they could be next. Silence was the currency of survival here. On the 7th day, construction equipment rolled in. A crew in yellow vests began unloading gravel and fencing panels. They didn't need to. They had permits, papers, and HOA backing. I watched from my window as a piece of my property, the very land I had paid for, worked on, lived in, was claimed by people who had never even stepped inside my home. That afternoon, I packed a box of essentials. I couldn't stop what was happening, but I could leave before I watched them pave over my life. As I drove away, I passed the clubhouse. A banner fluttered outside. "Community growth begins here." They took my yard, they took my peace, they nearly took my mind, all under the banner of community improvement. But I learned the truth far too late. When power hides behind rules, it doesn't need to knock down your door. It just needs you to sign once and look the other way.